we're going to learn about the cycles of matter today as part of our ecology unit. There are some important things we want to remember. First, let's think back to what we learned about how energy flows through an ecosystem. And that's exactly the key. It flows through an ecosystem. We're going to lose lots of usable energy in the form of heat due to the inefficiency of energy transformations. But matter is different. Matter is going to cycle through ecosystems. And there are a few cycles that are going to be particularly important to us. We're going to be interested in the water cycle because of the role that water plays in living things. It's critical for survival. We're going to be interested in carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. We actually are interested in potassium. We're just not going to go into that one in detail today. But these three are three of the big biogeochemical cycles that we need to learn about in order to understand how those elements move through ecosystems. Biogeochemical cycles are essentially closed-loop systems. It's technically a little more complicated than that because ecosystems are not boundaried by walls. So we can have movement of matter out of one ecosystem and into another. But if we think of Earth as one giant ecosystem or as the biosphere, then these geochemical cycles will be closed within that largest ecosystem view. So for each of these biogeochemical cycles, we're going to be interested in understanding 4 parts about the cycle. Those parts that are biological or the biological processes, so think about cellular respiration or ingestion and digestion and excretion of food. We're going to be interested in the geologic processes. How do some of these matter elements move through ecosystems? Things like volcanic eruptions, for example, can play an important role. We're going to be interested in chemical and physical processes, things like condensation and precipitation and the flow of water through ecosystems. And lastly, we can't ignore the role that human activity plays because human activity is disrupting some of these natural biogeochemical cycles. And the impacts may be very important in terms of what our environmental systems look like and how they function going into the future. So let's start with the water cycle. Water is going to move between oceans, land, and the atmosphere, and that's important because it's critical for the survival of all living things. The water cycle is also known as the hydrologic cycle, since the term hydrology means the study of water. And 2 important processes that you want to know about are going to be evaporation and transpiration. Evaporation, of course, is the movement of water from a liquid form into its gaseous state in the atmosphere, and transpiration is essentially the same thing, but that's referring specifically when it exits plants, and that's connected to solar energy. You also need to know about condensation and precipitation, and we'll talk about that in 1 second. And of course, once we have that precipitation, we're going to have absorption, infiltration, percolation, and in some cases runoff, all of which play important roles in the hydrologic cycle. And we might be interested to know how humans could be disrupting the hydrologic cycle as well. So if we take a look at this diagram, we can see some of these processes. Work your way through this diagram. So go ahead and pause the video now and talk yourself through each step in this diagram and make sure you know all of the major components of the hydrologic cycle. The next cycle we're particularly interested in is going to be the carbon cycle. As you've already learned, carbon forms the skeleton of the biomacromolecules that make up all living things. So hopefully right now in your mind you're thinking carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids, all of which have carbon within those molecules. So the carbon cycle is important. The big picture of the carbon cycle is that photosynthesis and cellular respiration are interdependent processes. The products of one are the reactants of the other. And that's a fundamental way that carbon is going to cycle through ecosystems. But there are also a few other ways that carbon dioxide cycles through ecosystems. There are geologic processes involved in the movement of the carbon cycle, things like photosynthesis and respiration, sedimentation, burial of organic material that ultimately turns into fossil fuels, gets extracted, and then humans combust it. So we have all of those pieces there, the biological processes, the chemical processes, the geologic processes, and even how human activity can influence. So let's take a look at a picture of the carbon cycle. Go ahead and pause the video now and walk yourself through this diagram. It's a little more complicated than the water cycle, so take some time to understand each component part. Our next cycle is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen, of course, is a limiting nutrient, particularly in aquatic environments, and the addition of nitrogen often results in a big bloom. And this is something that's familiar to us living along the Indian River Lagoon, where we've experienced recent issues with algal blooms due to increased nutrients in the water. Nitrogen is super important because in the same way that carbon forms the skeleton of the macromolecules, nitrogen is going to be really important for forming amino acids, which of course make up proteins, and the majority of our structures are protein-based. This cycle is a bit more complicated than the carbon cycle, so let's take a look at a photograph of this cycle and walk ourselves through the different processes that make it up. You know the drill. Pause the video here and really spend some time on this diagram. Use your textbook to help you understand each part of this process. The last cycle that we're going to talk about in any detail is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is important because, of course, it's found in DNA, and that's an essential part of any living thing. Phosphorus is also considered a limiting nutrient. It is not found in abundance, really, in any ecosystem, but aquatic ecosystems are particularly limited in phosphorus. So the addition of phosphorus does result in a bloom of photosynthetic organisms that can use that phosphorus. Its major sink, where you can find it, is going to be in rocks, and through geologic processes and physical processes and chemical processes, we're going to end up with phosphorus being broken down and released into both terrestrial and aquatic environments. It can be dissolved in the ocean, in the sediments and rocks that are exposed to ocean water, and any addition of phosphorus, again, can lead to algal blooms. The human activity one example that can impact the amount of phosphorus in waterways is actually our detergents. For a long time, most detergents had a significant amount of phosphorus in them, and it turned out that that was leading to problems in our local waterways, and so our federal government ultimately decided to ban phosphorus in common detergents. Another place, and again, specific to us locally, is agriculture, because of course phosphorus is a key component in most fertilizers. It's a necessary macronutrient for plants. By adding it to the soil, you can increase crop yield, but it also means that if it's not used carefully and thoughtfully, runoff, so connection to the hydrologic cycle there, runoff can carry that phosphorus away and into local waterways where it may lead to algal blooms. And this is problematic. One more time, pause the video, walk yourself through this diagram, making sure you understand each of the major processes and points along the way. Use your book for help if you need it. There are, of course, other cycles. We just don't learn about them all in detail. But things like calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sulfur are also important elements that living things need. Sulfur is a particularly interesting one because its primary source is through volcanic eruptions. So we don't necessarily think of volcanic eruptions as good things, but for living things, they can be necessary to some extent. Also, there are factors that will influence these elements as they move and cycle through ecosystems, and one of them is whether or not they're water soluble, because that will determine how accessible that particular element is to living things. And lastly, we can't talk about these elements and these nutrients without thinking about what happens if they are limited. So primary productivity, the rate at which producers create organic material, we would call that sugar in biology or carbohydrate, is determined in large part by the availability of key nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Without those two things, plants can't carry on robust photosynthesis. But also we need to think about other abiotic factors like water and light. Without the availability of water or the availability of light, photosynthetic organisms can't use the energy of sunlight to convert other molecules into carbohydrates that can be used by consumers. So there are different kinds of limiting nutrients. We tend to focus on nitrogen and phosphorus, but you could examine it from the macronutrient level or the micronutrient level. Think things like iodine and manganese that are needed for growth as well. And in general, it's important to note that the oceans are relatively nutrient poor, but their large volume results in a high overall primary productivity relative to terrestrial ecosystems, not on a per volume unit, but overall. So there's our lesson on biogeochemical cycles today.